American Gangster. The guy on the left here is Tango, and the guy on the right, portrayed by Denzel Washington, is Frank Lucas. But Tango has a problem. He owes Frank money and is unwilling to pay his debt. As a result, Frank shoots Tango in broad daylight 4 times in the head, which actually happened in real life, just under different circumstances. But we'll get into that later on in the video. In the 1970s, New York City was a violent concrete jungle. At this time, the Italians were at the top of the criminal hierarchy, which was firmly merged with authorities, so outsiders could rarely break through. At this time, the story of a black man making $1 million a day was unheard of, pretty much considered a myth or a joke. But this is what actually happened in the 1970s as Frank Lucas jumped into the criminal landscape to compete with the Italians. On November 2nd, 2007, American Gangster would be released, a movie based on Frank Lucas. Though some of the movie is factual, much of it is just Hollywood filler. We'll get to more of that later in the story though. Frank Lucas was born on September 9, 1930 in North Carolina. Frank's childhood took place in a turbulent time, later known as the Great Depression. This was not an easy time for any American, but more so for the African American population. This was a time where segregation was especially brutal in the South. When Frank was only 6 years old, something happened that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Young Frank sits in his room alone when suddenly he hears screaming. He runs out of the room and sees a young man holding a gun inside his 12-year-old cousin's mouth. A shot rang out. His cousin fell, face down. The back of his head was blown out. 5 members of the Ku Klux Klan killed his brother. As it turned out, the boy was killed for merely looking at a white woman. Frank claimed that it was this murder that pushed him to take a criminal path in life. Frank got older. He started robbing drunk customers near the local tobacco shop. He also worked as a truck driver, but was fired after he was caught sleeping with the boss's daughter. A fight would ensue, in which Lucas smashed an iron pipe over his boss's head, knocking him out cold. Frank then stole $400 from the cash register and set his former workplace on fire, burning it to the ground. At this point, his mother was worried Frank would end up in prison, or worse, dead. So at 16, she sent him to New York City, and young Lucas ended up in Harlem. Now in Harlem, Lucas wasted no time trying on the straight and narrow path. He decided he was going to be a full-time criminal. He robbed jewelry stores, then got his first gun, and started sticking up local bars and gambling spots. Soon, the aspiring criminal was noticed by Bumpy Johnson, who was known as the Godfather of Harlem. At the time, Harlem was in a disastrous state. Tenements filled with rats, roaches, and no lights. On every corner was a hustler, and all those hustlers belonged to Bumpy Johnson. A criminal named Flash Walker was Bumpy's right-hand man and driver, but when Flash crossed Bumpy, he would be sleeping with the fishes. And a few years before Bumpy's death, Frank would take over as his driver and the number 2 of the organization. After Bumpy's death, there was a power struggle in Harlem. For years, Bumpy got his powder from the Italians. Now that the Godfather was finally deceased, everyone wanted a piece. At the same time, the price for a kilo of heroin rose to $50K per kilo. Frank understood that only the Italians were making money at this price point. Something had to be done with these prices. Frank's first thought was when he seen how many American soldiers in Vietnam were addicted to heroin on a television program. The second thought was that the military men Frank knew said that Vietnam had the purest product, way better than the trash that was sold in Harlem. And third, Frank had a relative in Vietnam. It was a former U.S. Army Sergeant, Leslie Atkinson, who is called his cousin in the movie, but in actual fact, he was the husband of his cousin. After analyzing all these factors, Frank realized he had to go to Bangkok to test the product. Leslie Atkinson had lived in Bangkok for years, so he had solid connections. Frank's first shipment was 134 kilos at the price of $4,200 per kilo. Let me remind you that the price of a kilo in Harlem was $50,000. The movie doesn't point out that Frank got deathly sick while on this trip, being bedridden and delusional for over a month. While Frank was sick, Leslie got 28 exact replicas of government-issued coffins. The coffins looked just like the real ones, but had a secret compartment to store the powder. The general in charge of transporting the coffins was paid $100,000 to not interfere. In America, drugs were pulled from the coffins and taken to several locations in Harlem, such as car repair shops and laundromats, which were controlled by Frank's brothers. By eliminating the middleman, Frank created a situation where he could sell higher quality heroin than his competitors. But even better than that, he was able to sell it cheaper than his competitors. Thus, he was able to lure all the customers to himself. Frank began earning $1 million a day, expanding a network of businesses for money laundering. Frank took a page from the Italian Mafia, only letting the people closest to him into his business. The scene in American Gangster where Frank recruits his family members is actually true. But unlike the movie, Frank killed Tango long before his brothers were in the business. It actually happened in 1966 while Bumpy Johnson was still alive, and it was due to a $5,000 debt. The movie showed that Frank led a very modest lifestyle, but this wasn't entirely true. Lucas had a Rolls-Royce and a Mercedes-Benz. He dressed modestly and drove an old car only when he was scouting the streets of Harlem. The production of the movie really focuses on his modesty because it's not the norm for a gangster hustler. For example, the movie depicts Nicky Barnes as the flashy, I want all the attention kind of hustler, even going on the cover of the New York Times magazine. But after the movie aired, Nicky Barnes started to criticize it for misrepresenting reality. He stated that he only got his product from the Italians. He also comments on a scene in the movie where Frank yells at him for using the term blue magic on his product. According to Nicky, this never happened in reality. After the release of American Gangster, some people began to criticize the film. Most notably, federal judge Sterling Johnson, who claimed that Denzel Washington played a complete opposite person, not at all like the real Frank Lucas. Johnson claims that Frank Lucas was unbalanced, brash, and an angry person. He was not the brains of the organization. He was an ordinary errand boy, and his cousin, Leslie Atkinson, was the brains behind the organization. However, the reputation of this judge was very doubtful, so his words were not taken seriously, especially the remarks of Frank Lucas being an errand boy. After Lucas's arrest, authorities seized $50 million in cash. That doesn't sound like an errand boy to me. In the movie, the turning point and Frank's collapse comes during a boxing match in which Frank wears a $50,000 mink coat. Supposedly, authorities realized after this that Frank had taken over Bumpy's empire. But first of all, that coat was actually worth $130,000, not $50,000. And secondly, authorities already knew who Frank Lucas was. Also, during the fight, Lucas had better seats than the Italian Mafia, Frank Sinatra, Barbra Streisand, and Dustin Hoffman. And to make the night even crazier, both Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier personally greeted Frank. And most of all, white authorities were enraged to see a black criminal doing so well. The process of taking down Frank was tough, like depicted in the movie. 4 years passed after the boxing match before his brothers were finally arrested. The brothers went down first, then the authorities closed in on Frank Lucas. Frank Lucas's arrest didn't take place in front of a church like the movie depicted, and it definitely wasn't a cinematic spectacle. Frank and his wife were arrested during a raid of their home. His wife was arrested while throwing suitcases of money out the window. At trial, Lucas was sentenced to 70 years in prison. However, after the verdict passed, Lucas began to testify against his accomplices and corrupt police officials. As a result, he served only 5 years. He was set free in 1981 and placed under witness protection program. However, 3 years later, in 1984, he was arrested again for the same crimes. It would seem that this time, Frank would get a max sentence. But no. By this point, Richie Roberts, who had been a prosecutor in Frank's last trial, had gone into private practice as an attorney. Upon finding out about the arrest, Richie contacted his former nemesis, Frank Lucas, and started defending him in court, managing to get Frank only 7 years. This was considered a miracle. Frank Lucas later admits that he was a broke, shattered man once he left prison. Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019, at 88 years old. Thank you so much for watching this video on the American gangster himself, Frank Lucas. And if you like true crime, mafioso, gangster content like this, then please make sure to subscribe.